What if the ICU isn't just where lives are saved, but where the dead refuse to leave? Think you know hospitals? Between the beeping monitors and sterile gloves, there's a gap in reality. A place where coded patients whisper tomorrow's weather, and it storms. Where flatlined corpses sit bolt upright, gasping secrets no living soul should know. Nurses here don't just fight death, they negotiate with it. Ever heard a phantom code blue echo through empty halls? Seen shadows lean over beds, with no one there? This isn't House MD. These are raw, chilling testimonies from ICU veterans who've witnessed. Ghosts coding alongside them. Voices predicting deaths before monitors flatline. Handprints burned into walls from the inside. Still think stress explains it all? Press play. The ICU's darkest secrets don't stay on life support. The dead aren't gone. They're just waiting for quiet hours. I've been an ICU nurse for 6 years, and my pager is my lifeline. It's a small rectangle of black plastic that buzzes with the rhythm of this job. Updates on vitals, calls to rooms, alerts that snap me out of exhaustion during endless shifts. It's predictable, reliable, a tether to the chaos I've learned to navigate. But one midnight, it turned into something else. Something that reached beyond the sterile walls of the hospital and into a place I can't explain. It was a quiet night, the kind that settles over the ICU like a heavy fog. I was alone at the nurse's station, the dim blue glow of my computer screen the only light cutting through the shadows. The unit was hushed, just the steady hum of ventilators and the occasional beep of a monitor keeping me company. The clock read 12:03 a.m., and my shift stretched ahead, hours of charts and coffee to keep me sharp. I was mid-sip, the mug lukewarm against my lips, when my pager jolted me with a sharp buzz. I set the cup down, expecting a routine message. Maybe a patient's fore needed adjusting or a lab result had come through. But the screen stopped me cold. Look behind. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, one hand still on the mug, the other hovering over my keyboard. The station was empty, no rustling charts, no footsteps, just me in a pool of weak light. I turned slowly, heart hammering, half expecting a shadow, a face, something. But the corridor stretched out behind me, long and dim, lined with closed doors and swallowed by darkness at the far end. A fluorescent bulb flickered faintly, casting a stutter of light on the linoleum. I forced a shaky laugh. "Get it together, Priya," I muttered. It had to be a glitch. Pagers don't talk like that. Cryptic, personal. I chalked it up to a system error and went back to my charts, though the unease clung to me like damp scrubs. 10 minutes later, it buzzed again. "She needs you." My pulse spiked. I grabbed the roster, eyes darting over the list. 12 patients under my care that night. I flipped through their statuses. Mr. Carter in room 3, oxygen steady. Mrs. Lynn in room 8, sedated and stable. No emergencies, no red flags. Still, that message itched at me. "She needs you." I stood, clipboard in hand, and made a round, peering into each room. The soft glow of monitors lit sleeping faces, chest tubes rose and fell, everything was calm. I lingered by Mrs. Lynn's bed, adjusting her blanket when she stirred, but she didn't wake. Nothing urgent, nothing amiss. Back at the station, I stared at the pager, its blank screen daring me to doubt it. I was about to call IT when it vibrated again. "Don't forget her." A chill slithered down my spine. My mind raced, flipping through patients I'd known, those I'd saved, those I'd lost. One face rose like a ghost. Maya. She'd been in room 12, a young woman, barely 20, who'd come to us 4 days ago after a car wreck. Her sedan had skidded off the highway, crumpled against a guardrail. By the time she reached the ICU, blood was pooling in her chest, her skull fractured, her lungs failing. I'd poured everything into her, adjusted drips, monitored stats, held her cold hand when her family couldn't get there fast enough. I'd whispered to her, "We've got you, Maya," even as her heartbeat flatlined on the monitor. We didn't save her. She slipped away, and room 12 had been empty since, a hollow space that felt heavier every time I walked by. I shook my head, shoving the memory down. It was exhaustion, I told myself, doubles all week, too much coffee, not enough sleep. But the messages didn't stop. Over the next hour, they came faster, each one carving deeper into me. She's waiting. You did your best. It's time to let go. My hands shook as I gripped the pager. The words were too personal, like someone rifling through my guilt, my grief. I couldn't focus on my charts anymore. The lines blurred, my breath came shallow and quick. I had to know what was happening. I scrolled through the pager's log, each message timestamped, but the sender field was a row of zeros, no device ID, no trace. I called IT, rousing a groggy tech named Raj. Check the server, I snapped, sharper than I meant. He mumbled something about getting back to me and hung up. While I waited, I cross-checked the times with the hospital's main system. Every message looped back to one point, room 12. My stomach twisted. That couldn't be right. The room was offline, no active equipment, no staff assigned. It was a dead end. I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my stethoscope, not that I needed it, just for the familiar weight, and headed down the hall. The corridor felt longer than usual, the shadows thicker, the air stale. A light flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. When I reached room 12, the door was shut, the window beside it dark. My hand hovered over the handle, a tremor running through me. I pushed it open. The air inside was cool, still, laced with that sharp antiseptic smell that lingers in every hospital room. The bed was stripped to the mattress, the monitors unplugged, their screens black. I stepped in, the floor creaking under my sneakers, and stood there, waiting. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. Then the pager buzzed. Thank you. I yanked it from my pocket, staring at the screen. My throat tightened, tears pricking my eyes. Before I could speak, something brushed my cheek, a soft warmth, like a breath or a fleeting touch. The room shifted, alive for a heartbeat with something I couldn't name. I'm sorry, Maya, I whispered, my voice cracking. Tried. I really tried. Tears spilled over, hot against my skin. The pager went silent after that. No more messages, just a blank screen reflecting the dim light. I stayed too long, letting the quiet wrap around me. When I finally left, the hallway felt lighter, the weight on my chest easing, though I couldn't say why. I thought that was the end. 2 nights later, I was back on shift, still rattled but determined to move on. The pager stayed quiet, and I almost convinced myself it was a fluke, fatigue mixed with a tech glitch Raj couldn't pin down. Then, during rounds, I found something in room 7. Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman recovering from pneumonia, was asleep, her breathing raspy but steady. On her bedside table sat a small origami crane, crisp and white. It hadn't been there earlier, I'd have noticed. I picked it up, my hands trembling. Mrs. Patel stirred, her eyes half open, and murmured, "The nice girl made it for me." My breath hitched. Maya had loved origami. In her lucid moments, she'd folded cranes by the dozen, her bed a scatter of paper birds. I'd helped her once, fumbling the folds while she laughed at my clumsy hands. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? That a ghost was leaving gifts? That my pager had bridged some impossible gap? I tucked the crane into my pocket and kept moving. The ICU doesn't pause for mysteries. But it didn't stop there. A week later, I caught Dr. Ellis, a gruff cardiologist, staring at me during a shift change. "You okay, Priya?" he asked, his tone clipped but not unkind. I nodded, too quick, and he frowned. "Heard you talking to yourself in room 12 the other night." My stomach dropped. I hadn't realized anyone saw me. I mumbled something about stress and bolted, but his words stuck with me. Had I been loud? Had something else been there, loud enough for him to hear? Then there was Mr. Torres in room 5. He'd come in with a heart attack, surly and scared, but 3 nights after the crane, he grabbed my arm during rounds. "Tell her I said thanks," he rasped, eyes wide. "Who?" I asked, though dread pooled in my gut. The girl, she sat with me last night, said you'd understand. I stared at him, my mouth dry. No one had been in his room, no visitors, no staff. I checked the logs later, nothing. But I couldn't shake his words, or the way his grip lingered on my wrist. Weeks turned into a month, and the messages never came back. The pager sits in my pocket now, just a tool again, its weight familiar against my scrubs. Sometimes, when I'm alone at the station, I glance at it, half expecting it to flare to life with another impossible line. It doesn't. All I have left are the echoes, those cryptic buzzes, that brush of warmth, the crane I keep in my locker. They're pieces of a puzzle I can't solve, a goodbye that lingers in the hum of the ICU. This job teaches you to live with the unexplainable. Patients fade despite your hands on their chest, machines glitch, and sometimes, the air feels thick with things you can't see. Maybe it was Maya, easing the guilt I've carried since her gurney rolled out. Maybe it was me, wrestling with a loss I couldn't fix. I don't know. What I do know is this. Some nights, when the unit's too quiet, I feel her, watching, waiting, thanking me in ways I'll never fully grasp. And I keep going one buzz at a time, carrying her with me. I've been a nurse in the ICU for 7 years, long enough to know that some things defy explanation. The beeping monitors, the hiss of ventilators, the quiet shuffle of night shift rounds, they're my world. But it wasn't until my 3rd year that I noticed something strange about the wall clock above the nurse's station. It was a relic, really, with its faint tick and faded numbers, but it had always been reliable. Until one night, it stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m. I was doing my rounds, checking for drips and charting vitals, when I glanced up and saw it, both hands frozen, the second hand stuck mid-tick. I checked my watch. 3:18, then 3:19. Time was moving forward everywhere but on that clock. I tapped it, thinking the battery had died, but nothing happened. The air felt heavy, like the room was holding its breath. I shook it off and kept working. Hospitals are full of quirks, after all, but a strange unease clung to me. The next night, it happened again. 3:17 a.m., the clock stalled. This time, I lingered watching it. The air thickened, and I swear I heard faint footsteps echoing down the hallway. Not the usual squeak of sneakers or the clatter of a gurney, just a soft, deliberate tread, like someone pacing. I stepped into the corridor, my flashlight cutting through the dimness, but it was empty. Back at the station, the clock still read 3:17. Then, as inexplicably as it had stopped, it jolted forward, ticking normally again. I scribbled a note to mention it to maintenance, but deep down, I knew this wasn't a mechanical glitch. A few nights later, the patients started talking. Mrs. Jenkins, a sweet woman recovering from pneumonia, was the first. She grabbed my hand during rounds, her eyes wide. "He was here again," she whispered. "The man in white, pacing, muttering to himself." I thought it was the meds talking, delirium's common in the ICU, but she was lucid, her vitals steady. "What did he look like?" I asked, humoring her. "A doctor," she said. "Old coat, torn at the hem. He seemed lost." Soon, others chimed in. Mr. Carter, a gruff trucker with a broken leg, complained of the same figure in his dreams, pacing endlessly. A young woman in room 4, barely conscious after surgery, mumbled about a white shadow hovering near her bed. They all placed it around 3:17 a.m. I started keeping a log, not official, just a little notebook I tucked in my scrubs, tracking the clock stoppages and these eerie reports. The pattern was undeniable. I wasn't the only one noticing oddities. One night, I heard those footsteps again, louder this time, echoing through the unit. I followed the sound, my heart pounding, past the rows of sleeping patients and blinking monitors. It led me to the supply closet, but when I opened the door, there was nothing, just shelves of gauze and syringes. As I turned away, a chill brushed my neck, and the clock, visible through the doorway, read 3:17. That's when I decided to tell Dr. Tom. He'd joined the ICU a year ago, A stickler for precision, every second mattered to him. I figured his logical mind might unravel this mystery. "The clock's been stopping at 3:17, I said one evening, leaning against the station. "And the patients, they're dreaming of some man in white." He raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "A glitch, probably," he said. "But the dreams? That's curious." I could tell he didn't buy it, not fully, so I pressed him. "Stay tonight. See for yourself." He agreed, and we set up a vigil. At 3:15 a.m., we stood by the clock, the ICU hushed except for the usual hum. As the second hand ticked toward 3:17, the air grew dense, almost suffocating. The footsteps returned, faint at first, then insistent. Right on cue, the clock froze. Dr. Tom's eyes widened as a figure flickered into view in the corner. A man in a tattered white coat, his face etched with urgency and despair. "Not yet," he rasped, his voice like a gust of wind, before vanishing. The clock resumed, and the weight lifted. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Dr. Tom nodded, his usual calm rattled. We couldn't let it go. The next day, we dug into the hospital's archives, flipping through dusty logs in the basement. After hours, we found it, a record from 1972. Dr. Harold Wentworth, a surgeon, had collapsed mid-shift at 3:17 a.m., dead of a heart attack before he hit the floor. The notes mentioned a grueling surgery, a young woman he couldn't save. His last log entry read, "The weight is too much. I can't falter now." It hit me, the man in white wasn't just a ghost. He was trapped in that moment of failure. But the clock's behavior didn't stop at 3:17. I noticed it halting at other times too, always when Dr. Tom was stressed. One afternoon, he was treating a teenager with a failing heart, his brow furrowed as he barked orders. The clock stopped at 2:43 p.m., the air turning cold. No figure appeared, but the message felt clear. Later, Tom admitted he'd been doubting himself, terrified of losing the kid. The clock seemed tied to him, a mirror to his uncertainty. Things escalated one stormy night. I was alone, charting at the station, when every clock in the ICU, wall, desk, even the monitors, froze at 3:17. The power flickered, and a patient in room 6, comatose for weeks, suddenly sat up. "He's sorry," she croaked, her voice not her own, before collapsing back. I rushed to her side, but she was out again, vitals unchanged. When I told Dr. Tom, he went pale. "Sorry for what?" he muttered. That question drove us back to the archives. Tucked in a forgotten filing cabinet, I found a journal, Wentworth's, its leather cover cracked. Page after page detailed his exhaustion, his guilt over that lost patient. The final entry was scrawled in haste, "I should have saved her. My doubt killed her as much as my hands." It clicked. His spirit lingered, not just to relive his end, but to warn us. The climax came during a brutal shift. Dr. Tom was in surgery, a middle-aged man with a ruptured aneurysm. I watched from the gallery, tense as he hesitated over a critical incision. The clock stopped, 3:17 again, and Wentworth appeared, clearer than ever, standing over Tom's shoulder. "Trust yourself," he said, firm and loud. Tom blinked, steadied his hands, and finished the procedure. The patient survived. When Tom emerged, he looked at me and said, "I heard him." After that, we stopped trying to fix the clock. It became our silent sentinel, stopping whenever Tom wavered or I felt the burnout creeping in. The patient still saw the man in white sometimes, but I'd smile and tell them he was just checking in. For me, those years in the ICU had dulled my sense of purpose, until this. Wentworth's ghost taught me that our doubts don't define us, it's what we do with them that matters. Dr. Tom changed too. He started pacing himself, leaning on the team more. The clock still freezes occasionally, a reminder of time's fragility and the human limits we all share. We left it there, ticking away its strange rhythm, a bridge between past and present. In this ICU, where life hangs by a thread, It's a comfort to know even the restless find a way to heal us. My name is Miguel Torres, and I've been a nurse at St. Agnes Hospital for 6 years. The intensive care unit is my world, a relentless storm of crashing vitals, beeping monitors, and lives hanging by fragile threads. I thrive in it, the chaos sharpening my focus, making me feel alive. The ICU's long, narrow corridor, with its pale green walls and dim, flickering lamps, feels like home, until last spring, when something crept into my domain and turned it into a place I barely recognize. St. Agnes is ancient, built in an era when hospitals were more fortress than sanctuary. The corridor stretches endlessly, lined with faded portraits of doctors staring down with stern, unblinking eyes. The lamps cast a weak, yellowish glow, leaving shadows to pool in corners like spilled ink. The tiled floor echoes every step, and the air carries a faint mustiness, a reminder of decades of suffering soaked into the walls. It's the kind of place where you half expect to hear whispers, or catch a fleeting shape in the dark. It began with Mrs. Eleanor Harper, an 82-year-old widow wheeled into bed 4 with pneumonia. She was a wisp of a woman, balding, her skin wrinkled like crumpled paper, her breaths rasping through a chest too frail to fight. I'd seen patients like her countless times, but she brought something new. Every time I neared her bed, a sharp, acrid scent hit me, ash, like a campfire snuffed out with cold water. It wasn't overpowering, just a tickle in my nose, but it was there, persistent and sourceless. I checked everything, her gown, the vents, even the trash bin under the sink. Nothing. Maybe it's the old pipes, I told myself, adjusting her oxygen mask. Night shifts mess with your head. Fatigue conjures tricks of the senses. But this wasn't a trick. It followed me around her bed, a stubborn ghost of a smell that wouldn't fade. Days turned into a week, and the scent sharpened. I noticed a rhythm. It grew strongest just before Mrs. Harper's vitals faltered. I'd catch a whiff, and within minutes, her oxygen would dip or her heart rate would stutter. It was like an invisible alarm only I could sense. I mentioned it to my colleague, Nurse Jenny Alvarez, a wiry woman with 20 years at St. Agnes. She wrinkled her nose and shrugged. Old buildings have their smells, Miguel. You're imagining connections. But I wasn't. One night, as I charted at the nurse's station, its flickering fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the scent slammed into me, thick and choking, like I'd stumbled into a smoldering ruin. I bolted to bed 4. Mrs. Harper's monitors wailed, her blood pressure tanking. I worked fast, my hands steady as I adjusted her 4 and called for Dr. Priya Shah. Amid the chaos, I saw it. A shadow by her bed, tall and thin, draped in what looked like charred scrubs. Its face was a smudge, but its gaze pinned me, heavy and cold. I blinked, and it vanished. Mrs. Harper stabilized, her chest rising faintly, but the scent of ash coated my hands. I scrubbed them raw in the sink, water scalding, soap stinging. Nothing worked. It lingered, a mark I couldn't erase. That shadow shook me. I'm practical, not prone to ghost stories. Years of science and sweat had beaten that out of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that bed 4 was wrong. On a quiet shift, I sneaked into the basement archives, a labyrinth of dust and forgotten files. After hours of digging, I found a brittle newspaper clipping from 1978. A fire had ravaged the ICU, centered on bed 4's bay. A nurse, Evelyn Graves, died there, trapped when the flames blocked her escape. The photo showed a young woman with soft eyes and a kind smile, nothing like the faceless thing I'd seen. Jenny caught me later, her gray eyes narrowing. "You're digging up ghosts, huh?" I told her about the scent, the shadow. Her face paled. "I've smelled it too," she admitted, voice low. "Before bad nights. Thought it was just me." Mrs. Harper pulled through and was discharged, but the scent didn't leave. It trailed me, faint but constant, like a stain on my soul. Then Mr. Gerald Thompson arrived in bed 4, 75, septic, his body a battlefield of infection. The ash returned, stronger, coating the air as I hooked him to the ventilator. His vitals crashed twice that week, each time heralded by that bitter smell. During the second crash, the shadow loomed closer, its charred hands hovering over his chest, as if claiming him. I begged Dr. Shaw to move him. "Something's off with that bed," I said, voice tight. She sighed, her dark eyes tired. "Protocol, Miguel. Don't let your head run wild." But it wasn't my head. It was the air, the room, the hospital itself. One night, the scent was unbearable, the room thick with unseen smoke. Mr. Thompson coded, his heart flatlining as I pounded his chest, shouting for help. The shadow watched, its presence suffocating, and a whisper slithered through the chaos. "Let him go." He didn't make it. I stood over his still form, hands shaking, the ash mingling with the sting of antiseptic. The shadow faded, but its weight stayed with me. The scent didn't stop with Mr. Thompson. It crept to bed 5, a young woman, Maria Ruiz, fresh from surgery. She was 32, a mother of 2, her chart promising recovery. But the ash hit me as I checked her drains, and her vitals tanked, sudden, brutal. I fought to save her, glimpsing the shadow in the corner, its scrubs blackened and torn. She survived, clinging to life, but I was unraveling. I confided in Tom Rivera, my best friend and a paramedic who'd seen me through worse. We sat in a dingy pub, the clink of glasses dulling my nerves. "You're cracking, man," he said, sipping his beer. "Stress does weird shit. Take a break." I wanted to believe him, but the next shift, the scent spread to bed 6, an elderly man with COPD. His lungs gave out as the ash choked me, the shadow lingering just beyond my reach. I couldn't take it. I requested a transfer to the ER, desperate to escape the ICU's cursed halls. My last night there, the scent was everywhere, a suffocating shroud. I moved through my rounds, the shadow trailing me, flickering in the dim light. In bed 4, a new patient, an elderly man in a wheelchair, his white gown loose, his veined hands gripping the armrests, lay unconscious, heart failure dragging him under. The air grew heavy, the lamps dimming as the smell peaked. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, the lock clicking. The shadow solidified, its form sharpening into a woman, Evelyn Graves, her face burned, her eyes hollow yet pleading. "Help me," she rasped, her voice crackling like embers. "Tell them." The room chilled, monitors flickering. I stumbled back, heart pounding. "Tell who?" She pointed to the floor. A faint glow outlined a trapdoor, sealed beneath decades of tile. I pried it open with a bed rail, hands trembling, and found a singed journal, Evelyn's, its pages scrawled with warnings about faulty wiring, ignored safety checks, a hospital cover-up that sparked the fire. Her final words, "They'll kill me for this." She sighed, her form dissolving into ash that swirled and vanished. The scent lifted, the air clearing. I took the journal to the ethics board, triggering an investigation that exposed decades of negligence. Bed 4's bay was gutted, rebuilt, the trapdoor sealed forever. I'm in the ER now, away from the ICU's haunted shadows. The chaos here is different, fast, loud, alive. But on quiet nights, when the hospital hums with silence, I catch a whiff of ash, faint, fleeting. I glance at the monitors, half expecting Evelyn's stern, burned face in the corner, but it's always empty. Her journal sits in my locker, a reminder of a nurse who fought to be heard, even from beyond the ashes.